Today we talk about post-war Europe. What Europe was going to look like after the war was a topic of some concern. And there were a series of conferences among the Allies. First at Tehran, that would be the capital of Iran, in 1943. Yalta is on the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine. That was held in 1944. And then there was a third conference in Potsdam, that's a suburb of Berlin. That would have taken place after VE Day. All right. And these were serious conferences. I mean, the leaders of each of these countries showed up. And you can see there a picture. This is the Yalta Conference. You've got Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, FDR, President of the United States, and Stalin. All right, and you can see there Churchill and FDR can speak the same language and they have the same values and they're enjoying a little conversation with each other. And Stalin is sitting off to the side, dressed in a military uniform and looking away. That's a pretty good metaphor for what's going on. I mean, these allies, this is really a marriage of convenience, isn't it? They don't necessarily share the same values, but they behaved themselves, right? They realized that they had a task to complete, and that was the defeat of Nazi Germany. So they agreed to put their differences aside for the duration. And even though Hitler tried his best to, break the alliance apart, hey, he said to America and Britain, if you join me, we can fight Stalin together, eh? But no, that was not going to happen. And so the Allies, the alliance held, and an unconditional surrender was forced upon Germany. Okay. The price of this was that Eastern Europe was essentially delivered to Stalin. That this was going to be a Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin, of course, said all the right things about allowing free elections, but he didn't. Any place that had the misfortune to be liberated by the Red Army, all of a sudden, somehow, mysteriously, had a communist government imposed that took orders from Moscow. So that's the trouble with, especially with Poland, right? Because that was the issue that got Britain and France into the war, was the Nazi invasion of Poland. So the war was started over the issue of Polish independence. Well, unfortunately, Polish independence was going to have to wait. The Poles were liberated from the Nazis. They were delivered to the Soviets. Germany itself was divided into 4 zones of occupation. Okay, and you can see there these zones of occupation. There was a British zone, an American zone, and a French zone to the west, and then a Soviet zone to the east. Berlin, the capital, was completely within the Soviet zone. Okay? But that too was divided into 4. Berlin, of course, being the capital of Germany. So there is, okay. Where does the French zone come from? De Gaulle was very clever. Paris was liberated in October of 1944. So the collaborationist Vichy government was replaced by a provisional Free French government with de Gaulle at its head. And immediately this government declared war on Germany. So France avoided being occupied in the same way that Germany did or Japan did. All of a sudden, France is free, and free to carry out war. And so somehow the French managed to get their own zone of occupation. You can see there to the right in this, there's these areas that are shaded. Okay, what is going on there? Well, Stalin, again, poor Poland is always other people's playthings. Remember that Stalin had invaded Poland in 1939 when the Nazis invaded. And Stalin got about a third of Poland. Well, Stalin insisted on keeping this part of Poland. Okay, that is now part of the USSR. So to compensate Poland, eastern provinces of Germany and East Prussia were stripped from Germany and given to Poland. So all of Poland was moved about 100 kilometers to the west. Well, that's not a big deal because if you're Stalin, you just move people around. Okay, this is what you can do when you are a communist dictator. Other people are your playthings. And so, the Germans, of course, were expelled from Germany. Poles in eastern, formerly Poland, were just moved to what is now Poland. The other thing is the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They were also gobbled up by the Soviet Union, and they weren't. And it's interesting because, Poland and Romania and Hungary, they were all communists and they took orders from Moscow, but they were technically independent. The Baltic states weren't. The Soviets occupied them in 1939. Then the Germans came through, and then the Soviets, liberated them again in 1944. And I guess they were judged to be too close to the USSR, and so they were simply incorporated into the USSR as Soviet Socialist republics. Okay. I believe that the United States never recognized that as legitimate. And sure enough, once the Soviet Union imploded, the Baltic states got their independence again. And so here's a map sort of explaining that. You can see before the war, Germany is quite a bit bigger than it was after the war. You can see there just south of Lithuania is part of Germany called East Prussia. All right, then you've got an independent Poland. Then you see Danzig was given to Poland as an outlet to the sea. So as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not geographically contiguous, and that was a big issue. That was one of the reasons why Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. But that was a gamble that did not pay off, okay? And so you can see, following the war, Germany has been, it's lost some territory, okay? Poland itself has lost some territory. There's no more East Prussia. All right, Danzig is now Gdansk and completely Polish, completely stripped of its German population. But you'll also see that Germany was divided, okay, and we'll get to that. The four Western zones of occupation eventually were united into a country called West Germany. It was never united with the Soviet zone. And so that became East Germany. And you can see there all these countries in gray: East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. All of those countries were communist, and their governments essentially took orders from Moscow. Yugoslavia was also communist, but for some reason they never actually took orders from Moscow. Okay, but, there is some optimism, all right? Remember how at the end of the First World War, there was going to be a League of Nations, and that was going to, diplomacy was going to be open, right? We're not going to have secret treaties anymore. And so the United Nations was going to be, let's try again. Let's have the United Nations. And I believe it was founded in San Francisco in September of 1945. The headquarters of the UN is in New York City. Okay, every nation would be a member of the United Nations. And there would be an executive of the United Nations of 15 members. All right, and 10 of those would be rotating on and off, but there would be 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Basically, the USA, the USSR, France. Again, they always manage to win, right? France, the United Kingdom, and China. Okay. So these are the 5 permanent members of the United Nations with veto power. Okay. Needless to say, that was not a formula for a very effective organization, right? So it started out this great sense of idealism, but as the Cold War got going, it led to stagnation. Any sort of injustice in the world, the UN should do something about it. So the body passes a resolution and it goes up to the Security Council. And if it was introduced by the Soviets, the Americans would veto it. If it was introduced by the Americans, the Soviets would veto it. So the UN becomes kind of like the faculty senate at Reinhardt. Okay, it's just a place to pass resolutions, but there's absolutely no guarantee that anything is going to be put into practice. Okay, what about France? Recall that Charles de Gaulle in London founded the sort of Free French government in exile. The government of France, of course, was known as Vichy France. It was collaborationist with the Nazis. Okay, so with the D-Day invasions, de Gaulle comes over with them. And then once Paris was liberated in October of 1944, what was once the Free French government in exile now becomes the Provisional Government of France, and with de Gaulle as the head of that. And so this country now joins the war effort against Germany, joins the Allies, joins France, it joins Britain and the United States against the Nazis. And de Gaulle was just very good diplomatically. He insisted on this. He insisted on the French zone of occupation of Germany. He insisted on a place at the UN Security Council. And I think that that Britain and America were happy to allow this, because it would have been one more person on their side against Stalin. There's a picture from Wikipedia of the liberation of Paris. The French were actually kind of lucky about this, because the German commander in charge of Paris was ordered by Hitler to destroy it. All right, and he did not carry out that order. He said there's no point to this. In fact, he thought that Hitler had gone nuts by that point. So he surrendered to the French. All right, that's another thing de Gaulle insisted on, that it would be French troops to liberate Paris. The Americans sort of got to come in kind of in the rear, but it wasn't going to be. It was going to be France liberating itself, was the idea, and France would be spared a kind of military occupation by the Americans after the war. So France was very lucky in that way. Paris did not end up like Warsaw or some of these other cities in Eastern Europe. And you can say that this was terribly self-serving on the part of de Gaulle, but there are serious arguments made that de Gaulle saved France from communism. Okay, certainly by this point in the war, the communists had a great deal of prestige. There was a French Communist Party, and with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden the French Communist Party became a very important part of the resistance. And so there, as I say, there's a great deal of prestige for this party. But de Gaulle, of course, was not a communist. And when the Free French troops, quote unquote, liberated Paris, it kind of stole some of the thunder from the French communists. So that's one of the things that is said in de Gaulle's favor. And there were any number of lynchings of collaborators following the liberation of Paris and of other areas of France. But de Gaulle was not he was not about revenge on these people. Very quickly, he promulgated this sort of official myth that everyone had been in the resistance. And yeah, France as such was a victim of the Nazis, and then France altogether rose up and kicked them out. It's, as I say, it's self-serving, but it's what people do. Britain was a slightly different matter. Britain, the British are extremely proud of their role in the Second World War. They were the only country that was at war with Nazi Germany from 1939. Okay, they weren't defeated and occupied like the French were. They didn't make a deal with them like the Soviets did, and they didn't pretend they weren't a problem for a couple of years like the Americans did. And yes, Churchill didn't, he was tempted to make a deal with Hitler, but he didn't. He vowed to keep on fighting, and ultimately, Churchill was vindicated. Okay, so, all that stuff. Battle of Britain, Spitfires, D-Day, all of that is, the British are extremely proud of this. But World War II, in many ways, was a Pyrrhic victory for them. Pyrrhic is an adjective meaning, it's from Roman history, and it's essentially a victory that's so costly that you might as well not have had it. And in some ways, that describes Britain's role in the Second World War. First of all, austerity was, obviously during the war you have to have rationing. Rationing didn't end until the early 1950s. Okay, it took that long for Britain to get back on its feet. Similarly, they had to go deeply into debt in order to fund their war effort. A lot of that debt was owed to the United States. And I think that the British were hoping the Americans, in a spirit of comradeship, would forgive those loans. But they didn't, because, America decided to take advantage of Britain's state in order to replace them as the major power in the world. So even, there are cracks in the alliance in that way. And because Britain was so much in debt, basically this accelerated decolonization. Okay, the British were very proud of their empire, but of course, a lot of people didn't like having the British Empire imposed on them, and so there were indigenous independence movements, in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, places like this. And basically, Britain had to throw in the towel on its empire. They could have fought to keep it and to keep these nationalist movements down, but they couldn't afford to do that. And I think, it was, the moral right was not on their side, really. So yeah, so starting with Ghana and then moving on, the British let more and more of their colonies have their independence after the Second World War. As for actual politics, the man depicted there is named Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee was leader of the Labour Party, that is Labour with a U, being British. Attlee had been part of the wartime coalition government. Okay, remember that, with the declaration of war, the Conservatives who were in power invited some members of the opposition into the cabinet because, well, they basically wanted to suspend partisan politics for the duration. Okay, and this happens from time to time during times of emergency. Well, after VE Day, we're no longer in that state of emergency. So, the parties retreated to their sides and they held an election. And basically, the voters turfed out the Conservatives and returned all manner of members of the Labour Party. So Labour became Prime Minister. Now, how on earth turfed out Winston Churchill? The guy who gave all those great speeches, the guy who has that distinctive look, smoking his cigar, the victor of the Battle of Britain, and so on and so forth. Well, first of all, the victory was not entirely Churchill's. Obviously, Attlee and Labour Party would have shared in that victory. But more importantly, Labour was very good at promulgating the idea that Churchill was a great wartime prime minister, but Attlee will be a great piece that they were specifically thinking about was sort of a home fit for heroes, essentially a welfare state. Okay, by this point in the 20th century, the socialist idea that government has a role to play had taken over. And, they weren't communists necessarily, but they did believe that the state had a job to do. The state has to step in and redistribute resources and to make sure that everyone in society gets the care they need in order to live. And so that was there. That was the big promise of Labour, and the voters responded enthusiastically. So Labour takes power in July of 1945 and immediately began constructing a welfare state. Okay. The cornerstone of that, of course, is the National Health Service, which was Britain's state-run health service. And so, every hospital was nationalized, and all doctors were made state employees, and the whole thing was paid for out of taxes. But, you can go to the hospital and get treated for free. All right, so that's a big element of the welfare state. Obviously, welfare itself. You fall out of a job, you go on what they call the dole. All right, to help you out while you're unemployed. A lot of local councils build council housing. Okay, so that the local government builds just housing for the sake of people, working class people who can't afford a house. They can buy it at a cut rate from the local council, and so on and so forth. All right, so this becomes part of British life in the 20th century, is the construction of the welfare state. Now, obviously, this is not like all socialist schemes. Over time, there are certain weaknesses that reveal themselves. But at the beginning, I think there was a great deal of optimism. Okay, that finally, ordinary working class British people are going to be taken care of in a way that the free market never did. All right, so that describes post-war Britain. There is a bit of optimism amidst all the austerity that was still going on. Okay, we'll talk about the Cold War next time.